Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Welcome to this episode, another interview with one of the authors of the just released IPCC report that talks about impact, vulnerability, adaptation of climate change. And to me today, I have Bronwyn that's going to be sharing more of this insight to the reports that have just been published, more than thousands of pages that she needs to simplify for us to get to know what it's talking about, because every IPCC report comes with a strong warning, and it is our own part for us to see that we try to keep up to see we are able to win the race against the climate change crisis. We don't have time, we don't have much time to waste to see that we are trying to save the planet. It's the time to act is now. So this is the time that we need for us to see that we don't make the next generation bear the brunt of the crisis they never caused. And so she's going to be briefly explaining or giving us a brief introduction of ourselves. So you have the floor now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be talking to you from here in New Zealand. So it seems like such a long way from where you are, but I think what this report is showing is that around the world, everyone is affected by climate change, but there are some important parts of this report. So this report looks at how people in the community can adapt and how we can protect people from climate change. And the key message is that we're reaching the limits of what we can do to protect people, the limits of adaptation, much faster than we thought, and that there are about 3.5 billion people, about 40% of the world is now exposed to really serious climate risk. And I think especially for young people in Africa and Asia and here in the Pacific, these are really big issues that people know about immediately firsthand. At the moment, we have a series of floods happening here, both in the west coast of New Zealand and over in Australia, but the droughts, the storms, the cyclones that we've just had in the Pacific are on top of things like the volcanoes, are reminding us about what the report is saying, that the new element of the disasters that we're seeing is the way they compound and cascade. So they build up, several things are happening at the same time. A drought then has a huge effect for a community, for being able to support neighbouring areas. So it has a very big knock. Also, what's special about this report, or new, is we're really looking at the way in which cities in particular are places that are exposed to a lot of climate risk. And especially in Africa, I mean, by the middle of this century, 2/3 of the world will be living in cities, and about 90% of the growth that we expect to have happen in cities, we're expecting to have happen in the region of Africa and Asia. So it's really kind of the center of where a lot of change is happening. Cities, they also have an opportunity, and we have an opportunity when we're developing these cities and communities to really start making a difference and protect people in every way we can.
Okay, thank you so much. You've just given us a holistic view of what the report looks like. And looking at the report, talking about impact, vulnerability, adaptation, I want us to take it one after the other. Talking about adaptation, of which areas like Africa, Asia, Pacific needs to adapt to, but to a certain extent, there are some things we can't adapt to. You know, there are some new things we can't adapt to, and there's some things that loss and damage have taken away. So what are those adaptation measures that we need to do right now that we aren't doing, and might make each country or continent to be at risk of the climate change crisis from the report that was just released?
Yeah, well, I hope that this line is working, because we're breaking up a little bit. I don't know if it's breaking up at your end. But one of the things that's really quite important about this is exactly what you're saying. Chapter 9, which is the chapter for the African region of the report, It begins right up saying that Africa is experiencing very severe loss and damages beyond what a country can cope with and beyond what is fair or should ever be expected. So a lot of the changes that need to happen have to happen from the rest of the world recognizing that the countries within Africa have done very little, nothing to contribute to the problem, that there needs to be much more significant finance and support. But what they do suggest in the report is that some of the things that that we can do are exactly what you're doing, taking leadership roles, like speaking and improving governance and information and encouraging people to get engaged, because the issues are big in our countries. After COVID, the really high levels of unemployment and high levels of youth unemployment, it makes thinking about climate change just one of many problems. It's not even sometimes the biggest problem, you know, it's other issues, but it's the new youth leadership and the way in which we are communicating information, improving the way that we govern and what we expect of leaders and of our communities, that can really start helping, like finding ways in which people can talk about the issues that are of concern to them and where they would like and need the money spent. And then at the same time, the international community has to actually start really listening and prioritize the funding, but prioritize funding where communities need it, not where countries want to spend it. And it has to be funding that is grants, not loans, because what the report also talks about is the enormous amount of debt and pressure that's being placed on countries in the African region, having to borrow their communities, and this is really, really difficult. But one of the things that gives me a bit that they acknowledge that these issues that we're facing in climate are issues of human rights, they're issues of justice, they're issues where we need to use Indigenous and local knowledge to solve these problems. Now, this is the first time I've seen a science report signed off by 195 governments that acknowledges that what we're seeing now are really questions of human rights and justice. And so they can't say they didn't know. So being able to hold countries to account for not doing enough to protect young people, to protect other countries like those in Africa that are experiencing extreme loss of species and marine areas and loss of life, these communities, this report says, are experiencing not just injustice, but injustice that comes from colonization. It comes from years of deep inequity. Now, for a science report to say that, to actually talk about colonization in the context of climate is quite a big jump, you know, because the IPCC has been traditionally quite a conservative science body. So this means that the arguments about justice and fairness are becoming really entrenched in science now. And that's a big breakthrough, I think. And I think that the youth climate movements have a lot to contribute to this. And it was even spoken about at the launch of the IPCC report yesterday. The vice chair for this chapter said that it's been the youth movements that have really raised issues of moral justice and fairness in their protests and their speaking out that's actually meant that the public and governments are starting to really think about these issues in new ways. So I really thank you and lots of people like you for the enormous work that you're doing, because it feels like it's not doing anything, but it is changing a conversation. It's changing how people think about climate, so that it's not something technical that just scientists do and it's really hard to understand, but it's something about justice and rights and things that we can do and make a difference to. And once you start changing that, you give people an opportunity to really have a say. It's a very powerful thing you've done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that encouragement to the youth climate movement, because we believe that we can't wait for the future. We have to start now to start addressing those issues, to start calling for accountability in the best way we think it can be done, or it can work through various means. It could be protests, engagement, advocacy, different forms. So thank you so much that IPCC and you and many incredible people acknowledge the youth climate movement that is indispensable in climate action like this, to move leaders around the world to do something. And just before I could ask you another question, I just want to ask that looking at IPCC reports, I think there is a need for youth, young people, to be given the chance in this kind of deliberations, to be given slots in this kind of IPCC deliberations. I just want to know your thoughts about it, to see that we are also part of this decision-making process.
That's very interesting, because there are two things that could happen. I mean, one of the things that's been important about this report is that for the first time, community and Indigenous leaders and Indigenous knowledge has been written into the report. So they've contributed their experiences, ideas, and suggestions, particularly in the polar regions, but also in, for example, the Pacific. For Māori, where I am from New Zealand, there's lots of knowledge there. But there's also what they have are observer groups who are allowed to speak when the governments are reviewing these reports. There's a heated debate, and you have organisations like Greenpeace, the Quakers, other organisations. I'm not sure about Greenpeace, but definitely the Quakers and other environmental organisations can apply to be observers. And I think it would make an enormous difference. And I must raise this with the IPCC now that you say this, because I think it would make an enormous difference if there were more youth in the room. It would make, I think, people realise that as they're debating, they're really having to speak in front of people who will be affected by their whole lives by the decisions that are being made now. And I think that's a first start. I mean, it's only a little start, but it is a key, I think it is a key start, and it's a really interesting idea. I can't influence the whole of the IPCC, but as one scientist, I'll definitely take this up, because I think it's a really thoughtful idea. I think the other thing that the youth movements have done, especially when they're led by community knowledge locally, is that they've helped people stop feeling so alone in their worry about climate and the future. So we were talking today because a lot of students have written to me today feeling quite a lot of despair about how bad this report is in the middle of the pandemic, with a war breaking out in Ukraine and all the ongoing war. But yeah, I was going to say that the youth movement has really demonstrated how to take collective action. So here we would encourage students, whatever the group is that you work with, if it's your church, your sports group, your street, your tribal communities, whatever it is, working with other people really helps. Robert Bullard in the United States is a Black civil rights campaigner, and he has a wonderful expression about climate change. He said, it's not a sprint, it's not a marathon, it's a relay marathon across generations. And even though we have to act quickly, we're going to have to sustain that action from one generation to another over time. So it's learning how to support yourself so that you're not burnt out by the pressure and the worry, and working with other people really lifts you in that. But I just thank you so much for what you're doing, because it is inspiring.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. You said quite a number of things, and I really want to appreciate you for that you're going to bring up this issue of involving youth in IPCC processes and decision making, so that we become part of those people that are making decisions for the future and the present. And I just back to what you said before this question on youth. You talked about IPCC including colonization as part of this report. It makes it very fair enough, because colonization has its great impact it's making in a continent like Africa, saying about the exploitation and the rest. And just ask about things, because you also mentioned about the fact that climate change is one of the several crises that we are faced with. And so people less care about it. But now we are seeing climate change as a deadly pandemic, that if we don't act on it quickly as possible, just as the IPCC report tells us, then we are doomed, because there are some things we might not be able to recover again as it is right now, because we have learned about a report that was released this month that talks about African world's heritage and natural heritage being threatened by the climate change crisis. And just to ask that, what do you think can be done to curb all of this vulnerability? Because in IPCC reports, I learned that they also encourage local initiative or ideas or innovation. So what are those things that this report recommend for policymakers, for people to reduce our vulnerability to the impact of the climate change crisis, and to see how we can deal with this crisis?
What the report says is that the poorest of our communities, the disabled, ethnic minorities, and the elderly are going to be the most vulnerable. So actions that support the poorest of our communities make an enormous difference. But also, we have focused a lot on engineering solutions, and obviously we need to think about ways in which we protect our water resources, make sure that people have access to fresh drinking water, have access to a safe place to live. But the report says that thinking about social infrastructure, thinking about things like ensuring that people have education, health, and housing are actually really critical for protecting communities. Because if you are in a situation where you have an education and you have access to healthcare and you have somewhere safe to live, you are really advantaged no matter what happens with the climate. So starting with some of the social issues matters, and working with nature where we can. So bringing in the thinking about the planting, the way in which we are using nature to kind of protect and help our communities is important. And to think about things like even the informal settlements where a lot of children and young people live. Again, it's actually sometimes the most effective thing you can do right now is maybe education and health and housing. And then and starting small where you are makes a really enormous difference over time.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much. And I think reports like this on impact vulnerability of climate change will not leave fossil fuel and coal behind on these issues that causes the rise of global warming that makes our climate to change. So I just wanted to tell us that what did this report suggest of coal and fossil fuel, because they are the root cause of this crisis that we are passing through. So what is this report telling us about it? What is it warning world leaders about?
Yeah. Well, frustratingly, this report doesn't talk about how to cut emissions. It says we have to cut emissions with our adaptation. But the next report, so there's three of them. The first one was the physical science. This is protecting people adaptation. And then the next report is the one that comes out in a month and a half. And it looks at fossil fuels and how do we cut our emissions, change our economies. And by our economies, I'm really more meaning the global north has to do the work, because at the moment, most countries in the global south are doing as much as they can. They are limited by the historical, there's recognition in this report that past emissions are also affecting the climate now. So when we're starting to talk about climate justice in this report, we're starting to raise the questions about, well, who should take what action and how? So these are getting more and more difficult questions that every government has to look carefully at and work out in their own context how to do this. But the next report that comes out in about 9 weeks will look very carefully at how we can wean off and end coal and fossil fuels and cut emissions in our urban building and in our methane and farming and agriculture. Yeah. So that's the next part.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think IPCC authors and organizers, they're really doing a wonderful work, trying to spotlight all of these issues to governments, to the people, to see how we can meet up with the climate change crisis in solving this crisis. And so just my final question, talking about Africa adaptation, because now it is now imperative that we need to adapt to all of these changes. But what about the finance that is needed? It has to do with responsibility. Who is bearing the responsibility of what, and how it's going to be affected? So I just want to ask you on that aspect of Africa trying to adapt to all of these changes. It's going to take us, or it's going to need us to assess finance as soon as possible. So what is your thought about that?
I was just trying to find what the reports actually specifically said about finance, because they've said that the annual that Africa needs far more finance, international finance, to help it address its climate issues, and it has to be finance that is also directed and received in communities. So one of the concerns is that only in some areas, only about 46% of the funding that was received has actually been used on the ground. So we need to think really carefully about making sure that enough money is coming in and that that money is being delivered or aligned where it needs to be in local communities. And so it's two parts to it, that we need far more funding, and we need to make sure that that funding is going to the communities and the projects that people really need it to be in. And that means that it has to be an equitable partnership between local communities, international funders, governments, and businesses. And that partnership, a bit like you're suggesting about having youth involved in watching the IPCC, which I think is a really, really good idea and thoughtful. Again, having the community involved and thinking about how that funding is being spent. There's been some experiments with that in Kenya, for example, not talked about in this report, but that I know of from some of my PhD students from Kenya have looked at some of the different projects. Botswana's done involving the community and actually thinking carefully about where the money is allocated as well. But more funding for adaptation is critical, and that's highlighted in the report.
Thank you so much. I just want to point out in concluding this interview, what you mentioned yesterday through your Twitter handle, that you talked about some unnoticed fate, perhaps at first, but first, reaching out this new IPCC report over a long time is a focus on the justice and human rights. And so you share the picture that talks about climate resilience development, and the solution framework, number one, involves marginalized group, prioritize equality and justice, reconcile different interests, value, and worldview. So I really love those contributions and those insights you shared about the reports that needs people to look inward into it as a solution framework that could help to build resilience. And maybe you could just talk about that in a little bit, that some of those key points that we need to look into talking about this report, because not everybody can read the thousands of pages, but some of these key things you've outlined, what do you think we need to watch out for?
So climate resilient development is the idea that we are combining the actions we do for adaptation to protect ourselves and our communities with the actions we're doing for mitigation to reduce our emissions, to enable a livable and sustainable future for everyone. So it's really thinking about everything from tree planting that can be a crop, it can be a shade, and it can be something that absorbs water and holds the slope, stops mudslides as well. So you're doing multiple things at the same time.
Okay, just the concluding part of this interview. I know every report, every statement in the IPCC reports, it matters a lot, it means a lot. But can you just give us those key warnings, maybe for every continent, just in a briefly, of what this report is talking about? Maybe it pertains Africa or the world in general. What do they want us to know?
I think what this report is trying to say is that we have 3.5 billion people, 40% of the world is now at severe risk from climate change. And the most vulnerable are at risk. But we have a very narrow opportunity now in the next 10 years where we can take action to make a real difference for a safer, livable future for everyone. And we have to take that action right now. So I thank you for the inspiration that you give everybody for doing this action. But I also think that it is good that governments have signed this report off, that they have listened and approved some quite strong language talking about the way in which climate change is an issue of human rights. It's an issue of justice. It's been driven by inequality and experiences of colonization. That's pretty strong for a climate science report that 195 governments signed off and agreed to. So now we have to make it real. So now we know that it's a very serious issue. It's driven by inequality. Now is the time to act.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn, for honoring this interview. I really, really appreciate every bit of your time. I know you people have stressed yourself beyond your limit, trying to bring across different reports for the past week or months to see that you're able to bring out reports that matters a lot to the people of the future. Thank you so much for coming. And every IPCC report, it really matters because it tells us when we are on track and meeting the race against the climate change, and it tells us what we need to do that we are not doing and why we need to act now on the climate change crisis. So this report is further telling us that we don't have time. So this is the time we need to act. And for governments that have signed this report, I think it is time for us to put this into consideration because every bit of the commitment, every bit of report that is being signed, it really matters that we make it to become a reality in different agendas that we are trying to make. And also, most importantly, I think this IPCC report tells us that we need to make climate action a priority in different projects that we're trying to work on to see that the vulnerability of people are being reduced, and most importantly, looking at finance, that without finance, we can adapt to any of these changes that has been mentioned in this report. And without finance, it is difficult for us to avoid loss and damages, which it talks about. So for us to be able to complete climate action, definitely finance is necessary. So thank you once again, Bronwyn, for coming. I really appreciate you honoring this invitation at this particular time when you should be taking your rest. So thank you. This is what you do to keep our planet safe. I really appreciate it.
No, and thank you for the great idea about thinking about having youth observers, because wouldn't it be great if in 10 years, when the next reports come out as 7, the youth observers are watching and have seen the action that has been put into place now and are documenting how it's happening. So thank you very much for your inspiration and have a good day.
Thank you too. And thank you that you also be bringing this up in IPCC reports, maybe the next meeting, to see that we are part of it, because at some particular point, I saw a report that talks about that some countries want to remove that word of loss and damages, you know, so,
yes.
So when we are part of this meeting, we will know if truly they want to do such, and we will know how to go about it. We'll know how to stand to our family to talk about those issues. And just to ask, was that true that some countries wanted to remove that word of loss and damage, or just a rumor?
I think, we can't talk about the meetings, but this is where it's good to have observers. But what I can say is that always meetings are tense. because governments are thinking about the science they want, but scientists hold the pen. So we don't accept commentary that is not science. And I think one of the things that is that Africa can be particularly proud about is that Chapter 9 begins, and the very first statement in Chapter 9 on Africa is talking about loss and damage. And what this report does is it documents that loss and damage. The political debate about who pays for it, that happens outside the IPCC, but this process documents what is the loss and damage that needs to be paid for, how much money is available at the moment, is it going in the right places, what do we know from the evidence? And while the report says for Africa we need a lot more data, a lot more information, it's also a start in terms of clearly documenting what's happening.
So thank you so much. I think that is what makes a report credible, accountable enough, when it doesn't bow to pressure of removing any strong words, saying it's the way it is and what it is. It's going to make us to know what is at stake, not a report that is compromised. So thank you to you and your amazing team for this report that tells us more to act on the climate change crisis. Bye.